4 carriages arrived at Thornvale House before dawn, one from each of the greatest noble families in England. The coachman unloaded trunks, the housemaids scrambled, and somewhere near the kitchen entrance, a new footman reported for his first day of work. Quiet, unremarkable, carrying nothing but a worn satchel and a name that was not his own. His real name was Harwick Stonefeld, Duke of Grenfell, and he had done something that no man of his rank had dared to do in living memory. He had walked away from his title, his crest, and every expectation placed on him since birth, because he was tired of being chosen for what he owned rather than who he was. 4 noble houses, 4 women considered the finest matches in all of England, and not one of them had ever been tested by anything harder than a bad season. He intended to change that. What no one knew, not the ladies, not their mothers, not the whispering matchmakers, was that the quiet new footman, polishing silver in the corner, was watching everything. Every sharp word to a maid, every fake laugh over tea, every moment when no one important was looking, because that was exactly when the truth showed up. Now tell me something. If the person you were meant to marry was standing right in front of you, invisible in plain sight, what would they see in you? Drop your answer below. Tell us the beautiful part of the world you are watching from, and subscribe so you do not miss what happens next. The kitchen of Thornvale House woke before the sun did. Pots clanged, water boiled. The head cook, a wide woman named Mrs. Dunwick, moved through the steam like a general commanding a battlefield. She pointed at one maid, then another, issuing orders without pausing to breathe. Nobody questioned her. Nobody dared. It was into this controlled chaos that the new footman walked, satchel over one shoulder, dressed in plain servant's clothes that had clearly seen better days. He stood at the kitchen entrance for exactly 3 seconds before Mrs. Dunwick turned and fixed him with a look that could strip paint off a wall. "You are late," she said. "I am precisely on time," he replied, calm as still water. Mrs. Dunwick stared at him. In 20 years of running this kitchen, no new footman had ever answered her back on his first morning. She opened her mouth, closed it, then pointed at a stack of silver trays near the far wall. "Polish those, every single one, and do not speak again unless spoken to." He moved to the trays without another word, picked up the cloth, and began to work. His name, as far as Thornvale House was concerned, was Edmund Vale. A name common enough to forget, ordinary enough to pass without notice. He had chosen it carefully, the way a man chooses a disguise, not just for how it looks, but for how it feels when worn in the dark. His real name, known to only 2 people in all of England at this moment, was Harwick Stonefeld, Duke of Grenfell. He was 29 years old, the last of a powerful bloodline, and according to every matchmaker between London and the countryside, the most eligible man alive. He had sat through 7 formal introductions in the past 2 years. 7 carefully arranged meetings with women who arrived perfectly dressed, perfectly spoken, and perfectly empty behind the eyes. He had smiled through all of them, said the right things, written the right letters afterward, and felt absolutely nothing. It was his advisor, Lord Bentley Crowe, who had first called it a crisis. Harwick had called it something simpler. Clarity. He did not want a woman who performed well for a duke. He wanted to know who these women were when no duke was present, and the only way to know that, truly know it, was to remove the duke entirely. So here he was, polishing silver in a house that belonged to none of the 4 families, a neutral ground arranged quietly through Lord Crowe, where all 4 noble ladies would spend 3 weeks under one roof for the official pre-season gathering. It was common enough practice among the high families. Young women brought together before the formal events began to practice their social graces and be seen in the right company. What was not common was the footman standing quietly in the corner, watching all of it with eyes that missed nothing. The First Lady arrived at 9:30 in the morning. Her name was Lady Bettine Orville, eldest daughter of the Orville family of Westshire. She came through the front entrance with the kind of energy that expected applause. 3 trunks, 2 personal maids, and a small white dog that she carried under one arm like an accessory. She was striking in appearance, sharp-featured, with dark hair pinned so tightly it seemed to pull at her expression. She looked at every servant she passed, the way one looks at furniture. Present, but unimportant. Harwick watched her from the hallway, carrying a stack of folded linens as cover. She walked past him without a glance. He noted it, said nothing. The second lady arrived before noon. Lady Perrin Aldgate, from the Aldgate family of Norcia. She was the opposite of Bettine in almost every visible way. Softer in feature, quieter in movement, with the kind of careful grace that suggested she had been trained to take up as little space as possible. She smiled at the doorman when she entered. A small, genuine smile. Harwick caught it from across the entrance hall and filed it away like a man keeping accounts. The third arrived in the early afternoon. This one came with noise before she came with herself. Laughter floated down the gravel path before the carriage door even opened. Then out stepped Lady Toverine Cassel, from the Cassel family of Durham, accompanied by her younger cousin, and a maid who looked both exhausted and deeply entertained. Toverine was the kind of person who made a room feel like it had just caught fire in the best possible way. She talked with her hands. She greeted the housekeeper, Mrs. Aldberry, by name, even though she had apparently only met her once, 2 seasons ago. Mrs. Aldberry looked genuinely pleased. That alone told Harwick something worth knowing. The fourth arrived at dusk. No announcement, no fanfare. 1 small trunk, 1 quiet maid. Lady Solon Price of the Price family of Caldenmere stepped out of a plain carriage and stood for a moment in the fading light, looking up at Thornvale House with an expression that was hard to read. Not nervousness, exactly. Something more like the look a person wears when they have already decided something, but have not yet said it out loud. She was the last to arrive, and the first one Harwick found himself looking at twice. He was carrying a lantern at the time, lighting the path near the east entrance. She passed close enough that he could have spoken. She glanced at him the way most guests glanced at servants, briefly, automatically, and then she looked again. Not with recognition, just with something that felt oddly like attention. He kept his eyes down and moved on. That evening, at the long dinner table where all 4 ladies sat together for the first time, Harwick stood near the sideboard as part of the serving staff. He was close enough to hear everything, and invisible enough that no one bothered to lower their voices on his account. Bettine Orville spoke the most. She had opinions about everything, from the table arrangement to the quality of the soup, delivered with a smile that never quite reached her eyes. Perrin Aldgate agreed with most of what was said, but carefully, in a way that suggested she was less convinced than she appeared. Toverine Cassel made everyone laugh twice, and somehow got Mrs. Aldberry to bring out a second dessert that had not been planned. And Solon Price sat at the far end of the table, ate without complaint, asked one quiet question about the house's history that nobody could answer, and then listened to everyone else with the focused patience of someone who was also watching and also filing things away. Harwick refilled the water glasses and said nothing, but he was thinking a great deal. The second morning began with an incident that nobody was meant to see. Harwick was in the east corridor before 6, carrying a tray of breakfast things to the upper floor, when he heard a sharp sound from behind the third door on the left. Not a crash. More like the controlled slam of something placed down too hard by hands that were shaking. He stopped, listened. Then the door opened, and Bettine Orville stepped out into the corridor, already fully dressed, her jaw set so tight it looked like carved stone. She did not see him immediately. In that unguarded moment, her face held something raw and furious and almost frightened that had nothing to do with the polished woman at dinner the night before. Then she saw him. The mask came back instantly. "What are you doing, standing in the corridor?" she said, her voice clipped. "Delivering breakfast to the upper rooms, my lady." She looked at the tray, then at him. Something about the way he met her eyes, steady and unbothered, seemed to irritate her more than anything else could have. "Move along, then," she said sharply, and walked past him toward the stairs. Harwick continued down the corridor, but he turned the moment over in his mind, the way you turn a coin to check both sides. There was something in that house troubling Bettine Orville, and it had nothing to do with soup quality or table arrangements. By mid-morning, the ladies had gathered in the garden for what Mrs. Aldbury cheerfully called a constitutional walk. Harwick had been assigned to carry a small folding table and a basket of refreshments to the garden terrace, which meant he was present for most of it. Toverine was in full voice, telling a story about a horse, a ruined hat, and a very confused vicar that had Perrin laughing so hard she had to stop walking. Even Solène, who walked slightly apart from the group with her hands clasped behind her back, turned once and smiled at the ending. Bettine stood at the edge of the terrace, looking out over the grounds, not listening. Then a commotion erupted near the garden gate. One of the younger stable boys, a boy of perhaps 12 named Pip, had been leading a horse along the outer path when the animal startled at something, and the lead rope burned through his hands. The horse did not bolt far, but it knocked Pip sideways into the low stone wall, hard enough to leave him sitting on the ground with wide eyes and a bleeding palm. Everything happened fast after that. Toverine called out immediately, "Someone help him!" She was already moving, but her dress caught on the terrace steps, and she stumbled. Perrin froze. Her hand went to her mouth. Bettine turned, assessed the situation with one sharp look, and then turned back to face the garden. "The stable staff will manage it," she said evenly. Harwick was already setting down the folding table. He crossed to Pip in a few quick strides, crouched down, took the boy's injured hand, and checked it efficiently. Not deep. Shaken more than hurt. "You are all right," he said quietly. "Hold still." He tore a clean strip from the hem of his service cloth, something that would certainly earn him a word from Mrs. Dunwick later, and wrapped the boy's palm carefully. Pip looked up at him with the complete trust that small children sometimes give to strangers who arrive at the right moment. "Does it hurt badly?" Harwick asked. Pip shook his head, then nodded, then shook it again. "That is an honest answer," Harwick said, and the boy almost smiled. He helped Pip to his feet, steadied him, and handed him back to the stable hand who had come running from the gate. Then he returned to the terrace, picked up the folding table, and set it in place as if nothing had happened. When he looked up, Solon Price was watching him. Not the way guests usually watched servants when they had done something notable. Not with that particular brand of surprised approval that felt more like being patted on the head. She was watching him the way she had the night before at the east entrance, with actual attention, like someone trying to understand a thing, not just observe it. He looked away first. The afternoon brought letters. Lord Crow had arranged a simple system. A trusted courier would leave correspondence at the village inn, 2 miles from Thornvale, and Harwick would collect it during his off-hour in the guise of running an errand for the kitchen. It was during this short walk that he allowed himself to think without a mask on. He had seen enough in less than 2 days to fill a ledger with observations. Bettine Orville was sharp, composed, and hiding something significant. Perrin Aldgate was kind in her instincts, but governed by anxiety. She watched everyone else before deciding what to feel. Toverine Cassel had genuine warmth, and the rare gift of making people around her feel like they mattered. but he had not yet seen how she behaved when things stopped being pleasant. And Solon Price was a question he didn't yet have enough information to answer, which, he realized, made her the most interesting person in the house. He collected the letter from the inn. Lord Crow's handwriting was tight and urgent, even at the best of times. Today it read, "Word has reached Lady Orville in Westshire that her daughter Bettine has been placed in the same gathering as 3 rival families. She is not pleased. She has sent a private letter to Bettine. Whatever is in it, prepare for the weather inside that house to change." Harwick folded the letter, tucked it away, and walked back through the afternoon light toward Thornvale House. So that was what had been behind the 3rd door on the left. That evening, the atmosphere at dinner had shifted. Bettine was quieter, more deliberate, and twice she looked at Perrin with an expression that sat somewhere between calculation and dismissal. Perrin did not notice. Toverine noticed but said nothing, only steered the conversation with the practiced ease of someone who had grown up managing difficult rooms. Solon sat in her usual place at the far end, and at one point said something so quietly that only Harwick, standing near the sideboard, caught it. She said, to no one in particular, "Rooms like this always have more going on beneath them than above." Nobody responded. Perhaps nobody heard, but Harwick's hand paused for just a fraction of a second on the water jug before he continued pouring. He did not look at her. He did not need to. She had just said out loud the exact thought he had been carrying since the moment he walked through the kitchen door. That night, long after the house went quiet and the candles burned low, Harwick sat in the small room assigned to the male household staff and wrote in the plain leather journal he kept hidden at the bottom of his satchel. He wrote without title or date, only observations, only truth. He wrote, "Toverine moves like someone who was raised to make others feel welcome. It may be genuine. I need more time to know for certain. Perrin is good but afraid of herself. Bettine is intelligent and in pain, and currently dangerous because of it. And Solon Price notices things that other people do not notice, which means she is either the one I have been looking for, or the one most likely to see through me." He closed the journal, sat in the dark for a moment. Then he wrote one more line. "Either way, she bears watching." He closed the journal again, and this time he did not reopen it. Morning settled over Thornvale House like a cold hand pressed flat against warm skin. The pale light came through the corridor windows in long, thin strips, falling across the floorboards in silence. Most of the household was still finding its feet, maids moving in quiet pairs, the cook's voice carrying up from the kitchen in low, steady instructions. But Harwick had been awake for an hour already, dressed and moving, his mind still turning over the journal entry from the night before, like a stone being polished in a river. Solon Price notices things that other people do not notice. He had written it as a simple observation. Standing now in the grey corridor light, it felt considerably less simple. Mrs. Dunwick had assigned him to the morning correspondence run, collecting sealed letters from the hall table and delivering them to each lady's room before breakfast. It was unremarkable work, the kind that kept him near doors and voices and unguarded expressions. Exactly where he needed to be. He had 3 letters balanced in hand and was moving at a steady pace down the upper corridor when the 3rd door on the left swung open hard and fast, and Bettine Orville came out with the forward momentum of someone who had already been in an argument before they left the room. She was speaking in a sharp, clipped whisper, back over her shoulder, at her personal maid Tessie, who followed with the careful footsteps of someone walking behind a lit fuse. Bettine was not watching where she was going. Harwick, checking the crest seal on the top letter, was not watching for her. The collision was total and immediate. Letters went in every direction. 4 envelopes hit the floor and scattered, and one of them, sealed with a private family crest that had no business being visible to anyone outside the Orville household, spun face up and stopped directly between Bettine's feet. The corridor went silent. Bettine looked down at the letter, then up at Harwick, then back at the letter. Something moved behind her eyes, fast and cold, the way deep water moves beneath a surface that looks completely still. "You careless, witless fool," she said, each word arriving separately, like charges being read aloud. "My sincere apologies, my lady." Harwick crouched without haste and began collecting the letters one by one. Tessie dropped beside him immediately, hands shaking, gathering what she could reach. Bettina did not move. She stood over both of them, watching the private letter pass through a servant's hands, and everything that had been building in her chest since her mother's letter arrived 3 days ago reached its limit at precisely that moment. It moved up through her body faster than thought, and arrived at her hand before her mind could issue any instruction to the contrary. The slap landed sharp and hard across Harwick's left cheek. The sound of it rang down the empty corridor like a cracked bell. Tessie stopped breathing entirely. Harwick remained crouched for exactly 3 seconds. Still, unhurried. Then he rose to his full height with the letters held neatly in both hands, and he looked at Bettine with an expression that was completely, devastatingly calm. That calm was worse than any reaction she had prepared herself for. Her hand was still in the air. She lowered it slowly. Something crossed her face that was not anger anymore, and not triumph either. It was the look of a person who has just heard their own voice say something in a room that has gone unexpectedly quiet, and cannot take it back. "Your letter, my lady," Harwick said, and held it out. She took it from his hand without a word, looked at him for one more second, her jaw tight, something unreadable and deeply uncomfortable moving behind her eyes. Then she turned and walked away down the corridor, Tessie hurrying behind her, throwing one wide, stunned glance back before disappearing around the corner. Harwick stood alone, a slow, steady burn across his cheek. He touched it once, briefly, then straightened his jacket and continued the delivery round. He said nothing to any member of staff. He filed it in the same place he filed everything else, carefully, without sentiment, for examination later. But something had settled differently in him that morning. Bettine Orville was not simply difficult. She was fractured under pressure, and whatever her mother had written in that private letter had widened a crack that was already there before she arrived at Thornvale House. Breakfast passed without incident. Bettina came to the morning room last, composed and cool as fresh linen, and sat without looking at anyone for longer than politeness required. Tessie served her in near silence. Toverine, who missed almost nothing, glanced once at the faint mark still visible on Harwick's cheek as he passed with the tea tray. She did not say anything, but her eyes stayed on him for a moment longer than they should have. The afternoon brought something new. Mrs. Aldberry announced that the ballroom on the ground floor had been opened and prepared, and that the ladies were invited to practice their social movement ahead of the season's formal events. A dancing instructor had been arranged, a broad-shouldered, enormously serious man named Mr. Crofton Brigg, who arrived carrying a tuning fork and the absolute conviction that footwork was a moral matter. Harwick was assigned to assist with refreshments during the session, which meant carrying a tray of filled glasses to a side table at the edge of the ballroom floor and ensuring they remained stocked throughout. Simple work, but the ballroom was large, and the floor was polished to a near-mirror shine, and moving across it with a full tray required a degree of attention. He had almost reached the side table when he saw it coming, and made a precise, deliberate choice. Perrin Aldgate and Toverine were mid-step in a practice movement near the centre of the floor. Perrin had gone slightly off her line and was drifting toward the edge of the room. She was not going to hit the table. She was not going to hit Harwick. There was enough space, but she was moving with her eyes down, focused on her footwork, unaware of her own drift. Harwick stepped into her path. Not enough to cause a collision. Just enough to make the adjustment he was already making, the one that brought the tray to a slightly unstable angle, entirely believable. 3 glasses slid. 2 hit the ballroom floor with a clean, bright shatter. The 3rd rolled and struck the leg of the side table, spinning noisily across the polished wood before dropping. The music stopped. Every head turned. Perrin stumbled to a halt, looked at the broken glass at her feet, and immediately said, "Oh, I am so sorry. That was entirely my fault. I was not watching where I was going." Harwick was already crouching to gather the larger pieces. "Not at all, my lady. The fault is entirely mine. No, truly, I was drifting. I know I was drifting. Mr. Brigg told me twice already about my leftward drift, and I simply did not correct it." But Toverine had gone very quiet beside her, and from across the ballroom, Bettine Orville's voice arrived like a blade thrown from a distance. Can the staff not manage a simple tray without destroying the floor in the middle of a session? The room tightened. Mr. Brigg cleared his throat. Perrin looked mortified on Harwick's behalf. Toverine turned her head slowly toward Bettine, with an expression that was pleasant on the surface and made entirely of iron underneath. But it was not Bettine who stepped forward. It was Solon. She had been standing at the far edge of the room, slightly apart from the others, as was her habit, and she crossed the ballroom floor in a straight, unhurried line, crouched beside Harwick, and began helping collect the broken glass with her bare hands. "My lady, please." Harwick's voice came out differently than he intended. "You will cut yourself." "I have cut myself on worse," she said, without looking up. They worked in silence for a few seconds, and in those few seconds the ballroom held the particular kind of stillness that happens when a room full of people is watching something they cannot quite categorize. Then Toverine came and crouched on the other side. Perrin, after one anxious glance at Bettine, came and joined them. Bettine remained standing where she was, arms folded, jaw set, and said nothing further. When the glass was cleared and Harwick rose to his feet, he found Solon already standing, looking at him with that same steady quality of attention she had given him on the first evening. Not sympathy, not performance, just presence. "Thank you, my lady," he said quietly. She gave a single small nod, turned, and walked back to her position at the edge of the room. Mr. Brigg clapped his hands together and said, with the determination of a man refusing to let the afternoon be defeated, "Positions, if you please." The music started again. Harwick restocked the side table, and in the far corner, Toverine caught his eye as she moved back onto the floor, and gave him a look that said, plainly and without words, that she had seen everything that had happened in that ballroom, and had formed her own opinions about all of it. The evening after the ballroom incident carried a different kind of weight. Dinner was quieter than the nights before. The usual rhythm of conversation felt slightly off, the way a familiar song sounds when one instrument is playing just barely out of tune. Bettine ate with the deliberate focus of someone channeling a great deal of energy into appearing entirely normal. Perrin spoke a little too quickly, and laughed a little too readily at everything Toverine said, the nervous kindness of someone trying to smooth over a surface that everyone could still see was cracked. Toverine performed her usual warmth, but with a watchful quality behind it that had not been as visible before. And Solon sat in her customary place at the far end of the table and said almost nothing, which for her was not unusual, but tonight felt purposeful rather than habitual. Harwick served and observed and kept his expression entirely neutral. After dinner, Mrs. Aldbury announced that the following morning would include a formal carriage ride through the countryside, a social tradition expected of all pre-season gatherings, and that the ladies should be prepared by 9. There was a round of polite acknowledgement, and then the group dispersed toward their respective rooms earlier than usual. Harwick was collecting the last of the dinner things from the sideboard when he heard footsteps stop behind him. Edmund. He turned. Toverine Cassel stood in the doorway of the dining room, still in her evening dress, holding a small folded piece of paper in one hand. The rest of the house had gone quiet around her. "My lady," he said. She studied him for a moment. The laughter that usually lived so easily on her face was absent now. What was there instead was something considerably more serious and considerably more perceptive. "You are not a footman," she said. The room did not move. Neither did Harwick. "I beg your pardon, my lady?" "I said," Toverine repeated, not unkindly, "that you are not a footman. I have been around household staff my entire life. I know how they hold a tray. I know how they respond when they are spoken to harshly. I know the particular quality of someone who has spent years learning to make themselves invisible in a room." She tilted her head slightly. "You are doing all of those things correctly, but you are doing them the way someone who learned them deliberately, not the way someone does who grew up with no other choice." Harwick held her gaze and said absolutely nothing. Toverine looked at him for another long moment. Then she unfolded the small piece of paper in her hand, glanced at it briefly, refolded it, and tucked it away. "I will not say anything," she said simply. "Whatever your reasons are, they are your own. But I want you to know that I have noticed." She paused at the door. "And I suspect I am not the only one." She left. Harwick stood alone in the dining room with the serving cloth in his hand and the distinct cold clarity of a man whose carefully constructed position had just developed its first visible fracture. Toverine had not demanded answers. She had not threatened exposure. She had done something in some ways more unsettling. She had told him plainly that she saw him, and then chose to walk away. That choice told him more about her than anything else he had observed in 4 days. He needed to write to Crow immediately. He needed the letter out before morning. He was crossing the entrance hall toward the servants' corridor when the sound came from the upper landing. A voice, low and quick and furious, pressing through a half-open door in a language of controlled fury that carried even from a distance. Beton's voice. He slowed. "You will not tell me how to conduct myself in this house, or any other." The words came through the gap, sharp as cut glass. "I did not come here to be managed, Tessie. I came here because I had no other option, and you will remember your place." A long silence. Then Tessie's voice, quiet and tight with the kind of restraint that costs a great deal. "Yes, my lady." The door closed. Harwick stood at the bottom of the stairs for a moment. Then he continued toward the servants' corridor. He sat in his small room and wrote quickly by candlelight, not in his journal, but a short, coded note to Crow. "Toverine Cassel has identified the irregularity. Contained for now. Her discretion appears genuine, but cannot be relied upon indefinitely. Accelerate if anything on the Orville letters can be confirmed. Something in that house is pushing Bettina toward a breaking point, and it is not simply the season." He sealed it, slipped it into his jacket, and sat back. The candle threw long shadows across the narrow wall. Somewhere above him, the house settled and creaked the way old houses do at night, shifting under the weight of everything being lived inside them. He thought about Toverine, standing in the dining room doorway, with that folded paper and that quiet, level gaze. She had refused a proposal 8 months ago without explanation. She read rooms the way experienced people read weather, and she had just looked directly through his disguise and chosen, for reasons entirely her own, to say nothing about it. That was not the behavior of a woman chasing a title. He thought about Perrin, apologizing in the ballroom for a collision that was not truly her fault, worrying about her family's financial strain in a way that sat visibly behind every careful thing she said and did. He thought about Bettine, striking him in a corridor and spending the rest of the day being flawlessly composed, a woman of sharp intelligence and genuine capability being pressed into a shape by her mother's ambition that did not fit her actual self, and the friction of that mismatch was beginning to split her open at the seams. And he thought about Solon, crouching on a ballroom floor to collect broken glass with her bare hands while the room watched, not because she had something to prove, not because she wanted to be seen doing it, but simply because it needed doing and she was there. He picked up his journal. He opened it to a fresh page and sat with the pen in his hand for a long time without writing anything. Then he wrote, "I came here to test 4 women. I did not expect to be tested in return." He closed the journal, blew out the candle, lay back in the narrow bed in the full dark, and listened to the old house breathe around him. Outside, somewhere on the grounds, the wind moved through the garden and shook the last of the evening light from the trees, and Thornvale House held all of its secrets quietly, the way houses do, the way people do, until the moment comes when holding them any longer becomes impossible. That moment, Harwick understood clearly now, was not far off. Harwick had not slept. Not properly. He had lain in the narrow bed, staring at the ceiling with the candle blown out and the house breathing around him, and somewhere around the 3rd hour he had stopped pretending and simply sat up, pulled the journal from the satchel and held it without opening it. There was nothing new to write. He already knew what he was thinking. He just did not particularly want to think about it yet. Toverine Castle had looked straight through him, not guessed, not wondered. Looked straight through him the way you look through glass when you already know what is on the other side, named it quietly to his face, and then, and this was the part he kept returning to, walked away without asking for a single thing in return. He set the journal down. Outside the small window, the grounds were black and wet and still. He watched them until the black softened to grey, and then he got dressed and went downstairs, because a man with too much on his mind is better occupied than left alone with it. Mrs. Dunwick did not ask why he was early. She handed him a stack of linen and pointed at the morning room, and that was the entirety of their conversation, which was exactly what he needed. He was folding the last of it when he heard the side door. He turned without meaning to. Solon Price came around the inner corner from the east passage, coat still on, boots dark with grass. Wet, a colour in her face that only comes from cold air and moving through it on purpose. She had been outside, early, alone. She stopped when she saw him standing there with a folded tablecloth in his hands, and for a moment neither of them did anything at all. "My lady," he said. "Edmund," she said, the way people say a name when they are not entirely convinced it is the right one. She looked at the newspapers tucked under his arm. He held out the Gazette without being asked. She took it, looked at him once more. That look, that steady, particular attention that she seemed to carry around like it cost her nothing and meant everything. And then she went upstairs. He stood alone in the morning room with a tablecloth in his hands. He had interviewed 7 women across 2 years of formal introductions arranged by Lord Crow, and 3 different matchmakers, and not one of them had ever once made him feel like the less legible person in the room. He folded the tablecloth. He had work to do. The carriage ride was Mrs. Aldbury's idea of social maintenance. 2 hours through the countryside, the village, back again, ladies together, fresh air, the pretense of leisure over the reality of being seen in proximity to one another before the season began. Harwick and Oren, a permanent footman of 11 quiet and observant years, rode up with the drivers. Bettine and Perrin took the first carriage. Toverine and Solon took the second, directly below him. He was not listening. He could simply hear. Toverine's voice came up easy and warm, asking about Keldenmere, the winters there, whether they were as harsh as people said. Solon answered without the small deflection most people gave to Toverine's warmth, that half-step back that meant charmed, but keeping distance. Solon just answered. Yes, the winters were harsh. She had come to prefer them. There was something honest about a landscape that didn't try to be otherwise. That, Toverine said, and he could hear the smile in it, is a very specific way to love a place. Most ways of loving things are specific, Solon said. The road went quiet for a moment, the smooth stretch before the village where the wheels stopped arguing with the ground. Then Toverine's voice, lowered now. What do you make of all this? A pause. The kind of pause that means someone is deciding how much of the true answer to give. Not what I expected, Solon said. Then, after another beat, there is someone in this house I cannot account for, and I haven't decided yet whether that is a difficulty or the most interesting thing that has happened to me in 3 seasons. The road turned to gravel. The wheels picked up noise. Whatever Toverine said next was lost to it. But Solène's voice carried, clean and clear, through the open window. I know. I haven't decided what to do about it either. Harwick sat on the high carriage seat, with the morning wind against his face, and the village coming up ahead, and he let himself sit with the plain truth of his situation for the first time since he had walked through the kitchen door of Thornvale House. Toverine knew. Solon was close enough to know that the distance between suspicion and certainty was probably a single conversation. And the problem, the specific, inconvenient, entirely unexpected problem, was that both of those facts unsettled him for reasons that had nothing to do with the plan. That afternoon, Lord Crow's letter arrived via the village courier, and Harwick read it standing at the edge of the inn yard with the smell of horses and mud around him, and the afternoon sun doing very little against the chill. She is asking questions about the footman. Not to staff. To her cousin in writing. The cousin wrote to a friend whose household shares our courier route. I am not certain she suspects the full truth, but she is not letting it go. You have perhaps 4 days before it becomes a problem you cannot manage quietly. I advise you to conclude. Harwick folded the letter. 4 days. He walked back to Thornvale House and spent the return journey doing the thing he did when a situation became genuinely difficult, which was to stop thinking about strategy entirely and simply think about what was true. What was true was this. Toverine Cassel was the warmest person in the house, and the warmth was real. He had watched her carefully enough to know the difference. But she had also looked through his disguise in 4 days, which meant she was sharper than she allowed the room to see. A woman who hides her sharpness behind warmth is interesting. A woman who hides it and still chooses kindness with it is rare. What was true was this. Perrin Aldgate was good. Genuinely good. The kind that comes from the inside and not from instruction. But she was also frightened, and frightened people make decisions based on what feels safe rather than what they actually want. And Harwick didn't think he could build a life alongside someone who had not yet figured out that they were allowed to want things. What was true was this. Bettine Orville had struck him in a corridor and spent the rest of the day flawless, and there was a version of the world in which that intelligence and that control, freed from her mother's particular ambition, became something formidable and worth knowing. But he was not the person for the work of that freeing, and she would not thank him for trying. And what was true, most uncomfortably true, was this. Solon Price had crouched on a ballroom floor to pick up broken glass. That was not her problem, in front of a room full of people, without once checking to see whether anyone was watching her do it. She walked in the early morning alone. She read the Gazette. She had sat at the end of 4 dinner tables and said almost nothing, and everything she said landed like it had been weighed first. She suspected him, had suspected him for days, and instead of confronting it or ignoring it, she was sitting with the question quietly, the way she sat with everything, like a person who trusts herself enough to wait for the right answer. He was most of the way back to Thornvale when he stopped walking. He stood on the road with the house visible ahead through the trees, and he understood, with a clarity that was almost annoying in how long it had taken to arrive, that he had not come to Thornvale House to find the best candidate. He had come to find the one person who made the question feel different. He started walking again. The house waited. The trees moved. Somewhere inside it, a woman was sitting with an unanswered question that was also, in its own way, a question about him. He found her in the library. Not by design. He had been sent to collect the afternoon tea tray from the reading room, and had taken the long corridor by habit, and there she was, the only lamp in a room full of unlit ones, a book open on the table in front of her, but not being read. She was looking at the window. The garden beyond it was grey and still, and she was watching it with the expression of someone who is not looking at a garden, but thinking through something they cannot yet say out loud. He set down the empty tray he was carrying. She heard it. Turned. "I didn't mean to interrupt," he said. "You didn't?" she said. "I wasn't reading." He should have picked up the tray and kept going. He knew that. He picked up the tray and then he said, because 4 days of silence had apparently reached their limit, "You've been watching me since the first night." She did not pretend otherwise. "Yes." "Why?" She looked at him for a moment, and he had the feeling again, the one he couldn't account for, that she was deciding how much of the true answer to give. "Because something didn't fit," she said. "The way you held yourself, the way you spoke when you were spoken to harshly, which is not how someone speaks when they've been spoken to harshly their whole life." She paused. "You're very good at this. But good at something you learned is different from good at something you've always had to be." Harwick stood in the doorway of the library with a tea tray in his hands and said nothing. "I'm not going to ask who you are," Solon said. "That isn't my business. But I think you should know that I've noticed. And I think—" She stopped. Started again. "I think, whatever you came here looking for, you've been going about it in a way that's very lonely." That landed somewhere he had not expected it to land. "You could say that," he said. She nodded slowly, the way she nodded at most things, like she'd been expecting that answer and was simply confirming it. She looked back at the window. He stood for another moment in the doorway, the tray in his hands, and could not think of a single useful reason to leave. "May I ask you something?" he said. She didn't say no. "What are you sitting with? What you said in the carriage this morning, that you hadn't decided yet." A silence settled between them, not uncomfortable. The lamp threw long, warm shapes across the bookshelves. Outside the grey garden sat perfectly still. "I'm sitting with the fact," she said carefully, "that I came to this gathering because my family needed me to. Not because I wanted to." She turned from the window. "I've sat through a great deal of wanting in the last 3 seasons. Other people's wants. My mother wanting a particular name. Gentlemen wanting a particular picture of what their household should look like. I've become very good at spotting it." She looked at him directly. "You're not doing that. Whatever you're doing here, and I don't know what that is, it isn't wanting the picture of something, which is strange, and I haven't decided what to do with Strange." He set the tray down on the nearest surface. He did not entirely mean to do it. His hands simply made the decision before the rest of him caught up. "My name is not Edmund Vale," he said. The room did not move. "I know," she said simply. "Harwick Stonefeld." He watched her face. "Duke of Grenfell." Solon Price looked at him for a long time. Not with the sharp recalibration he might have expected, the sudden reassessment, the eyes moving over him again and arriving at a different conclusion about his value. She looked at him the same way she had looked at him, standing in the garden with the Gazette. The same way she had looked at him crouched on the ballroom floor, like a person who had already formed her opinion before the new information arrived, and was now simply checking whether it needed revising. Apparently it did not. "Why?" she said. "Just that." So he told her. Not all of it. He was not reckless. But enough. The 7 introductions. The women who had looked at him and saw a title wearing a face. The particular exhaustion of being chosen by people who did not know him and would not have chosen differently if they had. And Lord Crow's plan, cautiously, over weeks of arguing, taking shape into this house, and these 3 weeks, and a worn satchel, and a name that was not his own. She listened the way she did everything, without interruption, without performing her listening, without giving him the reassuring nods that most people give to fill silence. She simply listened. When he finished, she was quiet for a moment. "And what did you find?" she said. "More than I came looking for," he said. "And something I wasn't looking for at all." She looked at him steadily. "That's not an answer." "No," he said. "It isn't." Another silence. The lamp flickered once. "I need you to understand something," Solon said. "I am not. I don't respond well to being a solution to someone else's problem. If that's the shape this is taking, tell me now, and we'll behave as though this conversation didn't happen. That is not the shape it's taking. Then what shape is it taking?" He thought about it honestly. He had spent 4 days building observations about 4 women, and he had learned things worth knowing about all of them. But the truth, the one he had written in the journal at midnight, and then stared at in the dark without knowing quite what to do with it, was simpler than any observation. "I have sat in this house for 4 days," he said, "watching people be who they are when they think no one important is looking. And you are the same person in every room. You're the same person right now as you were picking up broken glass off a ballroom floor with a room full of people watching. And I don't know what to do with that either. But I know I don't want to walk away from it without saying so." Solon was very still. "That," she said after a moment, quietly, "is the most honest thing anyone has said to me in 3 years. I mean it." "I know you do." She looked down at her hands briefly. "That's what makes it difficult." He waited. "I'm not going to give you an answer tonight," she said. "I'm not someone who does that. I need time to think about something before I know what to think about it." "That seems entirely fair." "It is." She stood, picked up her book. At the door she paused without turning. "Edmund," she said, and there was something in the way she said it. Not mocking, something more careful. "For what it's worth, the way you spoke to that boy in the garden." "Pip." She stopped. "That told me more than 4 dinner tables." She left. Harwick stood alone in the library with the single lamp burning and the grey garden beyond the glass, and the very clear, very settled feeling of a man who has just done something irreversible and does not regret it even slightly. He picked up the tea tray. He walked back through the corridor toward the kitchen. He passed Mrs. Dunwick without a word and set the tray where it belonged. Then he went to his room, sat on the narrow bed, and opened the journal. He did not write for a long time. Then he wrote, I came here to remove the Duke and see what remained. I did not anticipate that someone would look at what remained and find it sufficient. I do not know what comes next. I know that for the first time, in longer than I care to calculate, I am not performing anything at all. Whatever happens, whatever she decides, this was real. That will have to be enough until it is more. He closed the journal. Outside, Thornvale House settled into its evening quiet, the candles burning low in the upper rooms, the grounds going dark by degrees. Somewhere down the corridor, a door opened and closed. Somewhere below, Mrs. Dunwick's voice carried one last instruction up through the floor before the kitchen went silent. The house held its breath. And in the morning, everything would be different. Not because anything had been decided, but because the truth had finally been said out loud. And truth, once spoken in a quiet room to the right person, has a way of refusing to go back to being a secret. 3 weeks is not a long time. It is long enough, however, to learn the difference between a person who is kind when it costs nothing and a person who is kind when it costs something. Long enough to watch someone move through difficulty and see what they reach for. Long enough to stop pretending you don't already know what you think. The gathering at Thornvale House ended on a Thursday, quietly, the way it had begun. Carriages in the early morning, trunks carried out, the gravel path busy for an hour and then still. Mrs. Dunwick made a breakfast that nobody had time to eat properly. Mrs. Aldbury stood at the front entrance and saw each lady off with the practiced warmth of a woman who had done this many times and meant it every time. Bettine Orville left first. She came down the stairs composed and cool, her 3 trunks already loaded, her small white dog under her arm. She paused at the bottom of the staircase and looked briefly at Harwick, standing near the door with a stack of folded travel rugs. She looked at him the way a person looks at something they have not fully resolved within themselves and have decided for now to leave unresolved. She did not apologize. He had not expected her to. But something moved across her face in that pause. Not regret exactly. Something quieter than regret. And then she walked out into the morning and the door closed behind her. He hoped, genuinely, that whoever she became without her mother's hand at her back would be someone she recognized. She had the intelligence for it. Whether she would find the courage was not his question to answer. Perrin Aldgate embraced Toverine at the door and cried a little, which surprised nobody. She shook Solon's hand, and then changed her mind, and embraced her too. On her way past Harwick, she stopped and said very quietly, "You were kind to that boy in the garden. I noticed." And then she blushed as though she hadn't meant to say it aloud, and hurried out to her carriage. He watched her go, and felt the particular fondness one feels for people who are still in the process of becoming brave. She would be all right. It would take longer than it should, because it always does for people who learned early that the world rewards smallness in women. But she would get there. Toverine left last among the 3. She came and stood in front of him with her travelling coat on, and her usual warmth present but underlaid this morning with something more serious. She looked at him for a moment without speaking. Then she said, "I hope it was worth it, whatever you found." "It was," he said. She studied him, smiled, not the broad social smile she wore like a flag, but the smaller, realer one underneath it. "Good," she said. Then she leaned in slightly and added, low enough that only he could hear, "She won't make it easy. Just so you know. She doesn't do anything the easy way." "I'm aware," he said. Toverine pulled on her gloves. "I like that you're aware." She walked out to her carriage, turned once at the step to look back at the house, and then she was gone. The gravel settled. The morning went quiet. Solon was already in the garden. He had known she would be. She had said goodbye to the others upstairs. He had heard the voices through the ceiling, and then she had come down and gone out the side door without ceremony, because that was entirely in keeping with who she was. She did not perform departures. He found her standing at the far end of the garden, near the iron gate, where the grounds gave way to open fields, her small trunk already loaded on her plain carriage at the front of the house. She was not looking at the fields. She was looking at nothing in particular, which was what she did when she was thinking something through. He walked across the wet grass and stopped a few feet from her and said nothing, because she would speak when she was ready and not before. She spoke. "I've been thinking," she said, "about what you said in the library." "Which part?" "The part where you said you didn't want to walk away without saying something." She turned to face him. Her expression was the same as it always was, steady, unhurried, giving nothing away that she hadn't decided to give. "I've decided I don't want to walk away either. But I need you to understand what that means, from my side." "Tell me." "It means I'm not interested in the Duke," she said plainly. "I'm aware that's an odd thing to say. I understand what comes with that name. The expectation, the machinery of it, all the things that would be asked of me. I'm not naive about any of it." She paused. But the man who wrapped a stable boy's hand with a torn service cloth and said that is an honest answer when the boy couldn't decide if it hurt, that is who I am saying yes to. And if those two things are the same person, genuinely the same person, then I think we have something worth finding out. Hawick looked at her, standing in the grey morning garden with her coat pulled close and her eyes perfectly direct and the quiet fields behind her, and he felt something shift in him the way foundations shift, not breaking, settling, finding the ground. "They are the same person," he said. "I came here to prove that to myself. I think I have." She nodded once, slowly. "Then write to me," she said. "Properly, not through Lord Crow and his courier routes." The edge of something almost warm came into her expression. "I want to know what you actually think, not what you observed. Those are sometimes the same thing." "I know," she said. "That's what I'm counting on." She held out her hand. He took it, not the formal grazing of fingertips that passed for contact in polite society, but a real grip, brief and certain, the kind that means I see you and I am not looking away. Then she walked back across the garden, through the side door, around to the front of the house where her plain carriage waited. He heard the door close. He heard the wheels on the gravel. He stood in the garden until the sound faded and the morning settled back into its own silence. He stayed there a moment longer. Then Hawick Stonefeld, Duke of Grenfeld, who had come to Thornvale House with a worn satchel and a borrowed name and a question he did not know how to ask any other way, walked back inside, went upstairs, packed the satchel for the last time, and placed the journal carefully at the top. He did not open it. He already knew what the last line would say. Some things do not need to be written down to be true. They simply are, quiet and settled and certain, the way the best things always are. Not loud, not sudden, just real.